All right, so we are recording now. So I try to, any of the presentations that I do, I understand not everybody can make them. I understand everybody lives all over Gwinnett and some people live outside Gwinnett, and I try to go for convenience. So pretty much everything that I do going forward, as long as I'm running the show, it's going to be virtual. I will do obviously some in-person workshops, and if the presentation works better as an in-person, it will be in person, but most of these evening presentations are going to be online, virtual. So the new schedule is already up on our website. Everything's pretty much free, so you can email Laura and Laura will get you signed up. So anything from December on, you should automatically get the Zoom link, since these are all coming from my account and I'm selecting the topics. Previously, obviously, I had to wait until I could send you a link because they were under my predecessor's Zoom account. So we're finishing up the last series that he had selected. And so this particular presentation is Fall is for Planting. And so it's not just planting a fall garden. There's all sorts of good stuff that you can plant in the fall. And we're going to kind of get into that. So when should you plant trees and shrubs? So you should plant trees and shrubs, the best time is fall. And that's because even though typically it's a little dry at this time of year, but the weather is usually really nice. So it's not too hot typically, so not in the 90s, not too cold either. And a lot of times we have an extended fall, which is awesome. So we may have from probably late September all the way through mid-November sometimes, nice temperatures in the maybe high 60s or 70s or even low 80s. And in the evenings, maybe, you know, in the 50s or high 40s, which is perfect. So that's great for fall color, but that's also perfect for when you're trying to get plants established, trees or shrubs, you know, flowers also, but we're probably going to talk a little bit more about trees and shrubs right now. And that's because soil temperatures tend to stay warmer longer. So while you don't have a really high evaporation rate because the air temperatures are so hot, your soil temperatures stay warmer. And so the root system has a better chance, assuming you're watering, which is pretty dry right now, so you definitely want to be watering, to get established. And that gives you all through the fall and then in the winter and into the spring so that you can help those roots get established before we get back into a hot Georgia summer. So first of all, when we're selecting plants that we want to put in the ground in our landscape, we want to check the roots. So obviously soil, that's a big thing, but you also want to make sure that you are selecting the best, healthiest plant that you possibly can get. And I think we're all probably guilty of going to the nursery, and maybe things are a little picked over because, I don't know, maybe, I know a lot of you know where Growers Outlet is here in Loganville, and a lot of us go there, spend a lot of money there. But sometimes, you know, they'll get a shipment of a particular plant in and there aren't very many left. And so the ones that are left are kind of scraggly looking, maybe not that great. But if you can, you slide them out of the pot and take a look and see. You want to see the plant on the right, the root system on the right, more than you want to see what's on the left. So this looks like it could be maybe a potted zinnia or something like that. And you can see the really healthy white root tissue. So those root hairs are kind of shiny white, maybe a little bit yellow, versus on the left, which they're kind of a brownish color. They don't look very healthy. There may be a little bit of fungus growing in there, and that tells you that you probably aren't going to see that plant survive very long. So you're going to want to select something with a root system like what you see on the right. You also want to kind of be aware of a root-bound plant, and you want to try to select something that is not growing through the holes in the bottom of the pot. You want to make sure that, yes, while that root system fills up that pot, again, it's not root bound, it's not growing through the holes in the bottom. So, when you're selecting these plants, you want to try to make sure that they haven't been exposed to overwatering, which that's going to cause your root rot. You don't want to see pests on your plants from the greenhouse, like whiteflies or aphids or something else. I understand some nurseries really want to not use pesticides, but there are solutions that you can use that are organics, like neem oil or insecticidal soap, that are a good alternative to using actual or synthetic pesticides. So we kind of want to make sure that there's a balance in there. And I know some of you have heard us talk about integrated pest management, or IPM, and this is a good place where you would want to see that happening. So make sure, again, to purchase healthy, vigorous stock, and you want your nursery to be a reputable supplier. So you want to try to make sure that you're minimizing the number of pests that are going to make it home to your house. So this is just an example, again, of what a healthy root ball looks like. So this one is obviously filled the entire pot. The roots are nice and white. I don't see any filaments of fungi growing anywhere in there that would tell me that it had been overwatered. So this, again, is a very good idea of what you would be purchasing. All right, next we'll move on to perk tests. So when you get home and you have this, maybe pickup truck load of plants, or the back of your SUV filled with plants, you gotta usually know where you want to put them. Not all of us do that. I am guilty of going to the nursery, just like a lot of you are, and seeing something, I'm like, oh, I don't really need any plants, but I think that I am going to purchase this one. And so you end up with, maybe 3 or 4 plants that you really didn't expect you were going to purchase. And so now they're at home, and you have to figure out, where am I going to put them? So some of us are guilty of just digging a hole and slapping them in that hole. I mean, we know, obviously, sun and shade, that kind of thing, but we haven't really put a lot of thought into the soil. And so we here at Extension, of course, always say soil is the basis of everything. So you want to make sure that when you're putting those plants into the ground, that you are taking care. You just dropped, maybe not much, maybe $4 or $5, but it could be an expensive plant. If you've gone to a bigger nursery, I mean, you could be spending $25, $35 or more, or even, maybe you got a nice potted Japanese maple and you want to put that in the ground. Yeah, I could have dropped a couple $100 on that. So you want to make sure that you are taking care, and that means you're going to do a perk test. So some of you might be familiar with a perk test. If you live in a house that has a septic tank, this is something, or if you've built a house that has a septic tank, this is something you probably had to go through. You had to have the soil scientists out. They dug a bunch of holes in your yard and put some water in there, and they did a timed test to see how long it took for that water to disappear. And so you're going to do basically the same thing here. You're going to do a perk test. You're going to dig a hole. You're going to fill it with water. And you want most of that water to drain out within about an hour or so. I don't have that problem here. Most times it's gone way before that. But as long as it's an hour or less, that means the drainage is good. But keep in mind that if a decent amount of water remains, probably means that the clay content in there is too high. And so you may want to look for an alternate place to put that plant. In fact, you may have to do quite a few around the property in order to find the best place. So, and again, we don't want to just jam the plant down into the hole, or think that you can dig a hole that's bigger. Usually we say about 3 times the size of the plant, but don't think that you can just dig a bigger hole and then it'll be okay. Generally, soil types kind of fluctuate throughout a property. So it does make sense to try to have a couple different spots in mind where you think you might want to put your plant. And then once you do the perk test, You get a good happy medium somewhere in there. Go with that spot. Don't just stick it in the hole and hope for the best, because that never works out very well. All right, so an interesting statistic: more plants are killed in Georgia from too much water than from lack of water. So as we've kind of seen here, you can go through a feast or famine type situation. Right now we're getting a little bit of rain, but it's been about a month since we've gotten rain before. And that's kind of hard on your landscape. So right now we're not seeing a ton of plants die from too much water, but like I said, feast or famine. So we went through a period in May and June where we didn't get much rain either. We went through another month or so without rain. And then it seemed like it rained all summer long, although I still don't think it was enough because everything is profoundly dry again. So, keeping that in mind, and also the lay of the land, a lot of us have, some slope to our yards. And so if it's kind of in a low spot, you may end up having a garden that looks a little bit like this picture, where the water tends to catch and it gets inundated. I have a hillside. My house is on a slope, but the water runs down the driveway and then it runs around the side. And I've got chickens on one side of my house. And until I changed some of the slope and filtered the water in a different direction, my poor birds were drowning. And so were the plants that were planted around the coop. So you have to kind of keep an eye on that. And when you have too much water, you can end up with waterlogged plants and soil rot and decay. And then you're kind of back to square one, and you're back at the nursery going, oh no, I have another bill for 50 some odd dollars and some plants. So maybe I should pay attention to what hole I stick them in next time. So I don't think we have too many new folks on the presentation this time around, but some people are weather nerds. I'm a weather nerd. I've kind of followed it my whole life. I like to look at the radar and see how much we're getting. I also like to know roughly what we get per month, so I can kind of plan, am I going to put a fall garden in, or is it looking like it's going to be kind of dry? Do I need to water this month? That kind of thing. So here you can see the average inches of rainfall by month. And this is just kind of an average. I believe this is Lawrenceville, but that's kind of representative of Gwinnett County. So for those who are listening to this program who maybe are new and not too familiar with the weather systems that we have here, just kind of a real quick rundown of what we see per year. So generally from December through probably May, you're going to get Gulf systems that come up with large glugs of moisture. This is what we've got kind of going on right now. We have a weather disturbance. It's basically attached to the Gulf. It's got a Gulf Stream. It's sucking up a lot of moisture. And so you get this big shield of rain that moves over the area and can give you anywhere from half an inch to a couple inches of rain. And that's typically what we see in the wintertime here. And then about May or so, late May, around Memorial Day, through probably the end of August, we get summer thunderstorms, summer pop-up thunderstorms. So it's really hot and humid here. Rain is generally spotty. You get a lot of unstable air in the atmosphere, and you'll get afternoon thunderstorms, and they could pop up pretty much anywhere. You might get a couple courses that train over you in an afternoon or an evening, or you may not get anything. But generally speaking, over the course of a couple weeks, pretty much everybody gets a little bit of something. Although I think we all will kind of sit here and go, why is it always skipping over me? Well, really, it's not. When you look at the plot of the rain over the course of a couple months, usually everybody has pretty much something. It's about the same. And then you can note here that starting at the end of September through probably November into December, it gets pretty dry around here. The summer rains, the summer pop-up thunderstorms kind of stop, and we don't really see those anymore. What we tend to see is only tropical systems. So if we have hurricanes that move through the Gulf or along the coast, if we don't have a high pressure system sitting over us, steering that away, we may get some tropical moisture. And that's pretty much all we really get during the month of October and November. And that's one of the reasons why we're so dry right now. We have a big high pressure system that has been sitting over us for a while. That's what steered Ian away when we were supposed to get some rain from that hurricane. We didn't get any. We have this system right now, but it'll be a little while before we see some more rain. And then we head back into December when the Gulf systems kick up again and we start to get more rain. So, we can have, gardens all year round and we can plant, but we need to be aware of what the weather is so that we can make sure that our plants get what they need in order to survive and thrive. All right, solutions to wet sites. So you can plant on elevated beds. You can see here up in the top left, we've got a raised hardscape bed. So maybe that area is a little wet. You get a little runoff that kind of goes through there. So you can actually plant in a raised bed. You can break apart that hard pan layer. So clay is what is actually used to line pond systems. It helps keep that water in so that it doesn't seep out. If you've been through the Master Gardener course, which I know a lot of you have, you're aware that clay particles are smaller than any of the others, sand or loam or any of those. They're very small. And so when you have a lot of clay together, it's really easy for rain to just kind of run off or to hold that moisture there if it's in a low area. And so if you go in and you break that hard pan layer up, then that allows that water to kind of drain through. You can select adapted plants. So you see in the lower left, if you have a low area, you might put some sedges in there. You might put some swamp iris in there. You might put something that really doesn't care if it has wet feet. So there are a lot of kind of inundated plants or palustrin type wetland plants that do really well in situations like this, where sometimes they have wet feet and sometimes they're dry, but they just don't really care. They just tolerate it more than others. Their root system is just better adapted to that. You can also go through and install a subsurface drainage or put in a French drain. You can see right below that's a French drain. They come in and put a drain, put in some landscape fabric, some geotextile fabric. You put a drain system in and then backfill with gravel around that. And that helps drain that water away from that site, either into a storm sewer or to a lower area in the back away from the sidewalk in this case, or other low area so that it's not constantly flooded. And you can also consider a rain garden. So the lower left again, you can see there they've got some water loving plants. They also have some large river stone. So you can consider just making a rain garden. And yes, it's not just dumping gravel there. You've got different surfaces or different layers under the surface, different texture sands, granite sand, larger gravel, that kind of thing. And that helps the water kind of drain down through and back into the earth. It's also, you can put some larger boulders in there and make it really aesthetically pleasing. So there's definitely a way you can handle that. All right, so now kind of let's move on to proper planting procedures. So if you follow these procedures, assuming that you're watering, making the right choices, that kind of thing, like I suggested earlier, you should have success with your plants. So now we're going to kind of switch and we're going to talk a little bit about planting trees. So these are assuming that you're probably planting something more than a 5-gallon tree. So a 5-gallon tree or a 7-gallon tree is going to be just in a plastic pot. There's nothing in there. There's no wire. There's no burlap. So when you have a balled and burlapped tree or shrub, that's going to be a lot larger and consequently a lot more expensive. So you want to make sure that you take the proper care when you're installing these. As we go through these slides, you're going to see some of them are very sad and you're probably going to go, that poor tree, what happened? Well, a landscape crew that didn't really care. They just wanted to get those plants in the ground, installed those, and then you see the results from that. So There are some rules. So if you have a larger tree like what you see in the top picture, you're going to pull that burlap back from the top 1/3 or so from the root ball. You can see that we did that in the picture below on that shrub. If you can remove it completely, that's great. That makes it a whole lot easier. So there's different types of burlap. If you have natural burlap, that will disintegrate over time. It's biodegradable, but there are some synthetic types of burlap that are just plastic, and those do not. So those can get all twisted up in the roots. If you don't know the type that you have, you're probably best to just remove it if you can. So you want to get that off. And if you see, like up in the top picture, that one has wire around it. It'll have a wire cage. The bigger the root ball, so for instance, if you have a rather large tree that's maybe 15 feet tall or 20 feet tall, it's going to have a pretty decent root ball on it. That one is going to be caged. So you want to make sure that you're going to go with wire cutters and you're going to cut that wire away so that, and you may not be able to remove it entirely. You may not be able to get rid of it, but what you don't want to do is leave it on there to strangle that root system. So cut as much away of that wire as you possibly can so that you don't have to deal with the bad stuff further on down the line. So you can see here, this is the reason why we remove that wire cage and why we remove the twine. So again, I mentioned that the burlap, sometimes it's synthetic, sometimes it's organic, and a lot of times the twine is also synthetic. That does not break down, it's plastic. So it just will stay there in perpetuity. And what happens? Well, eventually that tree grows and does the best that it can given the situation. So it's going to grow until it does what? Strangles itself, or girdling. So you can see there's some selections here of bad things that have happened to these poor trees. So you can see in the top left that tree is just so sad. I can't tell if the twine has been removed, but it's probably not going to do well. The bottom right, that one looks like they caught it before it did too much damage. You can see in the top right that the cage is still there. A lot of the roots have been snipped, but that one is obviously deceased. And in the bottom left, you can see that the root system somehow managed to grow through the burlap, but that burlap is still there. So I'm going to take a stab that it's probably a nylon or a plastic burlap, and that just, that tree's not going to be long for this earth if it continues to try to grow through that. So like I said, girdled and strangled. All right. So if you have plants that are not balled and burlapped and they're coming out of a pot, again, I mentioned that the best way to do that is to purchase one that is not pot bound and get something that is healthy but doesn't have roots that are wrapped around the entire thing and poking out the bottom drainage holes. So the one on the left, you can see that one is nice and filled the pot. The root system looks pretty good. But what you're going to do is you're going to cut 4 slices. So you're going to cut 4 equal slices. And what that's doing is disrupting the root system. So if you don't disrupt the root system and you take all the care of trying to dig the best hole and make sure that it's the right depth and make sure that, everything is in there, and you don't do anything to disrupt the root system, it's going to take forever, and it may not ever really branch out and reach out into the soil around it. When I moved into my house, they had some basic landscape plantings, and the first dry year that we had, I lost quite a few of them. And when I went and pulled the plants up to replace them, I noted that they were still in their original shape of what they'd been in the pot. Nobody did anything to try to break that root system up and give it some incentive to grow out into the soil. And so they just kind of sat there and did not a whole lot of anything until it got dry. And then when the soil around it got dry, they died. So the new plants that went in were cut and just the root system was disrupted and pulled apart to give it an incentive to grow out into that soil. So you can kind of see that here. The one on the right is a little bit root bound, but you can still salvage that. Disrupting that one will allow it to grow out into the soil around it too. All right, so follow good planting practices. So you want to make sure that when you're digging a hole, especially for a larger tree, the soil here, you might be using a pickaxe on it. Right now you would be, but it's very tempting to just dig a hole that's just big enough to fit whatever it is you're trying to put in it. Don't do that. Make sure that the hole is at least 2 times wider than the root ball itself. So if you have a 5 or 10 or a 15-gallon plant, that's going to be a pretty good sized hole. And it's going to take a lot of work. So just be aware of that when you're selecting whatever it is that you're wanting to put into the ground. And when you place that, that plant into the ground, the tree or the bush, you want to make sure that that root ball is level with the soil surface. That's very important. And you can see that they've used probably their shovel here, and that's kind of laid across the top of the hole. So make sure you're not mounding all the soil all around it. You want to lay that. And then when you put that plant in there, look at the top of that root ball. Look at where the trunk meets the root ball. You want that to be about level with where that shovel is, or whatever implement that you're using. That's a good rule of thumb. And no amendments for trees and shrubs. We're probably all guilty of, if we're dealing with the really hard pan clay soil that we have here, that we're like, we'll just go down to the big box store and we'll just get a bag of topsoil and we'll mix a little bit of that in. And that'll make it better. It'll amend it, add some some good organic matter. Topsoil that you buy there is pretty much just composted pine bark. So, I mean, I'm even guilty of that. I think we all are. We're like, I don't want to spend all this money on a tree only to have it, dry up and die because either it won't hold water, or too much water, whichever. So there is actually some research that shows that organic matter added to individual planting holes can actually be detrimental to plant growth. So it's really not recommended to put that in there. You can see here the soil that he's putting back in with this tree. Looks like it has a little bit of organic matter. I mean, if I'm dealing with a straight up clay soil, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually go in and I know it says 2 times. I'll actually dig the hole about 3 times. And for that 3x size hole for that plant, I might add a little bit of organic matter, just a little, not much. So maybe like a quarter organic matter to natural soil. So yeah, does that really go against the research? Yeah, but does it add a little bit of organic matter, which kind of helps us a tiny bit with drainage? To me, it does. It's a trade-off, but I wouldn't go much more than that. You can certainly play around with it. It's your money, but that's what research states. And this is the reason why. So it holds water and the roots don't explore and it dries out. So you put that plant in there, and if you mix in a bunch of organic matter, then that'll hold the water right then and there, and the roots just kind of stay there and they don't ever really go anywhere. So it's going to kind of limit what your plant's going to do, and it'll start struggling as it gets larger. So I know some of us, if we have perennials or annuals that we're planting, depending on what type of soil it is, we may go ahead and just put some landscape fabric down and then put planting soil on top of that and just have kind of a raised bed situation. In an annual or a perennial, that's fine. When you're talking about a shrub or a tree, not so much. You've got to have that in the ground. So we have to kind of follow a few different rules with situations like that. So basically adding a fine texture and organic amendment like the compost that I was talking about, or peat moss or something like that, it soaks up a lot of water and you can actually end up with some root rot. So if you've got a lot of money that's tied up in the plants that you're purchasing and putting in the hole, you don't really want to do that, because you want that plant, you want the roots of that plant to explore out into the soil so that it'll have a good base and it will be healthy going forward. So if you do have a drought situation like what we're experiencing now, that tree will be better able to sustain itself versus having everything kind of compacted in a very narrow area where it can't. So when you plant that tree, you're going to backfill with that loosened soil that you've set aside. And so some people, if you've got a really nice lawn, Bermuda, zoysia, fescue, whatever, again, you might have a tarp down and you put all that soil over there onto that tarp. And then you move that back through, you make sure that you're putting it around that root base, tamping it down a little bit and getting it so that to eliminate the air pockets, and then make sure, again, that that is level with the top of that root ball. So it's going to kind of look like this. So the right way to do it is on the left. Just hang on a second. Somebody's not muted. If you are not muted, please mute yourself. I'm getting some feedback. So you can see on the right that the root flare is, some people probably don't know about the name for it, but you kind of look at it and you're like, it either looks right or wrong, right? So you see on the left, you've got the right way to plant it, and that trunk kind of flares out towards the base, and that's the correct way to plant it. If you're looking at it after you've backfilled and it's just completely straight up and down, like on the right, that's the wrong way to do it. Your root flare needs to be up above the soil line. It's very important. And I will explain why it's very important. But you want to make sure that that's how it is, because if you don't do that, you're ultimately going to end up with a dead tree. So here's some examples. So if you walk into a yard and you see the top left, that tree, I don't see a root flare. I also see some signs of canker, and there's a reason for that. As I mentioned, that it's not healthy for the tree. Now the tree itself will attempt to fix that, the tree or the shrub, whichever you're planting. So what you're seeing here, are adventitious roots. So right where I've put the little arrows, these roots can grow off of stems. They can grow off of rhizomes. What they're doing is they're sending out basically a new root system. So in the case of looks like maybe a boxwood in the lower left, you can see where the original root system was, but it was planted too deep, probably about 6 to 8 inches too deep. And so it developed an entire new root system above that. It's not supposed to happen like that. That's not healthy. The tissues, and I'll explain this also, the tissues between the trunk of the tree or the stem of the shrub are different than the root tissues. So they, breathe differently, they absorb nutrients differently, that kind of thing. So this is not what we want to see. You can see up here in the top right that they've come in and kind of excavated around this a little bit. Either it had soil that was up against the trunk, or maybe some composted or some mulch or something that has broken down and basically become soil. Either way, the tree was buried too deeply, and so those adventitious roots have formed. All right, irrigation. So this may seem a little out of place, but really we have to talk about it, because when you're putting a lot of money into a shrub or a tree and you're plunking that dude in the ground, fall's a good time to do that, but sometimes it's dry. Like it's been pretty dry here. So if you're putting some trees or shrubs in the ground now, you're going to need to water. So how much? How often? When you're looking at the establishment of that shrub or that tree over the first 1.5 years, so one whole cycle and then a half year into that. So if you're planting now, that means that you're going to have to make sure that plant gets about 1 inch of water a week for the next 1.5 years. So that's actually a long time. Some of us kind of just baby it until spring and then forget about it. And you can't do that. You've got to take it all the way through one full year and then usually into the spring of the second year. And usually by then, if you've done all the correct steps, you're pretty safe. And unless we have a really big dry spell like we're having now, you won't have to do a whole lot to it. But just kind of keep an eye on the plant and make sure that it's not wilting excessively, that kind of thing. And secondly, you also want to make sure that that 1 inch of water that you're putting on that tree, you want to make sure that's actually penetrating deeply and not just running off. So you can see, and I don't have a picture here, but you can get drip hoses, have that around the base of the hole where you've just planted. You can run a very slow trickle from a garden hose over that. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that. If you have a smaller plant, you can buy, I actually have these. I have some small native azaleas that are struggling. I planted them in the spring, but you can get these. I don't know, you can't put it in front of my face. There you go. You can get these off Amazon. They're just basically small funnels and you can attach it to like a Coke bottle or something like that. And then you just stick that in the ground. And some of them have little valves that you can, put on there that you can turn to have a slow trickle of water. They're not very expensive. I think I got 12 for $6. So it looks a little ugly, but if you have a bunch of new plants that, like I did, I put in the spring, then you appreciate not having to go out there and water that often. And since you're putting it right in the root zone where it needs it, then it's fine. You can just fill the bottle up and stick it in there and forget about it, and you're good for the next week. Oops, sorry. So the moral of the story is never put a $100 tree into a $2 hole. Just make sure that you're doing the right planting practices for the plant that you're putting in there. All right, rules for your landscape. So mulch. Some people think of it as just a pretty thing to look at that kind of makes their yard look pretty. Some people are really into it and they mulch their whole garden. I'm one of those. It cuts down on a lot of evaporation. So, I mean, there's a lot of good uses for it. You can use the expensive stuff that looks pretty in your landscape in the front. You can get the free stuff, excuse me, from Chip Drop. That's a service in the metro area that if you sign up, Tree Services will come and dump a load of tree bark, tree mulch, cut up trees in your driveway, and you can use that in your garden. Again, don't plant directly in that. That's meant to be kind of a moisture barrier on the surface, but it does a great job of insulating soil, retaining moisture. It's a good weed barrier, helps prevent soil compaction. You're adding some organic matter to the soil as that breaks down, as you get termites and other things that kind of move into it. And it helps reduce lawnmower weed eater damage and adds a bit of an aesthetic touch. So just to kind of bring up the lawnmower weed eater damage. So you can see I've got a picture of some trees here and they've used mulch underneath those trees. So some of you are new master gardeners in the class right now. You had a class on pruning today with Seth Hawkins, and he touched on the fact that he doesn't like grass and he doesn't think that you should be mowing grass under your trees. And I agree, because number one, it can damage the root system by running over that, but you can also run your lawnmower into the trunk of the tree. There's a lot of reasons why we don't want to do that. I'll go into that a little bit more here. But generally speaking, you don't want to damage the trunk. So the easiest thing to do is to draw a circle around drip line of the tree. The drip line, if you're not aware, is basically the edge of the canopy. So if you just took a plumb line and dropped that straight down from the edge of the tree's the canopy, or the furthest out branch, that's going to be your drip line. Technically, that is where you should put mulch. A lot of us can't really do that. So if you can even do half of that, that's going to help the tree. So think about doing that. And then these are just some typical types of mulch that we'll see in the landscape that's aesthetically pleasing that you'll have in your front yard. There's pine bark mulch. You have the big chips and the mini chips. It kind of floats. So if you're in an area that's kind of getting a lot of water that's moving through there, probably not the best choice. But if it's a slope like this, it'll be okay. Pine straw, a lot of HOAs say that you got to have pine straw, you got to refresh it. It does a good job. It breaks down. It's good organic matter. Not terribly expensive to put, one batch out, but if you're having to do it a couple times a year, it can get pricey pretty quick. Cypress mulch. Cypress mulch doesn't typically float like the pine bark mulch does, and cypress mulch takes a little bit longer to break down. So sometimes that's a good option. It's a little lighter in color than pine bark mulch or hardwood mulch. So just kind of keep that in mind. I do tend to use it in some of my planting beds just because it takes a while to break down. So for me, it's a dollar cost averaging thing. And then you can also get hardwood mulch. So sometimes tree companies will shred some of the waste tree byproduct that they have. They'll shred the stumps and then they'll add color to it. So you might get something like you see in the bottom right where it's been kind of tinted a brownish color. They'll add a powdered kind of a dye to it. And, so economical for them to create and, recycling. So moving on, we're going to start talking a little bit about problems. And most of these are going to be with mulch. So I'm not going to ask you to chime in. If you really want to, you can unmute yourself and tell me what the problem is here. I'll give you a couple seconds if somebody wants to be brave. Any ideas?
There's a mulch mound.
Yes, that's right. There is a mulch mound. So you can see here, they've come through and neatly put all these big mounds of mulch here. And we call that volcano mulching. So I looked for a GIF. I couldn't find one where the lava was, spreading out. But anyway, I thought this was kind of cute. So this is what we call volcano mulching or over mulching. And you can see, it just kind of overdoes it. So going down the same line of thinking that I was talking about before, and why we want to be very careful about how and why we put soil when we're burying a trunk, the same thing goes for mulch, because ultimately mulch is going to break down, it's going to biodegrade, and it's going to turn into a soil product. So when you have this much mulch, that's a problem. And this is why we don't over mulch. So you can see here, again, going back to the root flare, when we talked about how do you plant it correctly. So the bottom right picture is what it should look like. Oh yeah, sorry. I had thrown my volcano in there. I like it. But the root, that's how it should look. If you put any mulch out, it shouldn't cover that root flare. You should still see that. And so when you look at the other pictures, what's missing? The root flare. It's not there. It's because they've put that mulch all the way up against the base of that tree. So you can see they're trying to excavate. And that's one thing that landscapers will do if you've done that. They'll go in and they'll actually excavate out or use a pressure washer and usually try to blast off the soil from around those roots. And then a lot of times they'll go in and try to clip the roots and try to rehabilitate the tree. And so if they catch it before too much damage is done, they're usually able to do that. But you can see here the damage, if you leave that mulch volcano, against that tree trunk for, you know, a couple years, you can see what happens. I mean, that tree is pretty efficient. It starts growing those adventitious roots out. And so this is why some of you, again, who are master gardeners and who have gone through the class and are going through right now, are going to probably recognize this. Hopefully someone's thrown it up on the screen so far. Why this is a bad thing. Not only will it grow these adventitious roots, but when you put that mulch up against that tree, I already mentioned to you that there's different types of tissues. So your bark and your trunk tissue is very different than your root tissue. The root tissue, the root hairs, the roots themselves are meant to uptake nutrients and water, whereas the bark is not. It's just not. And so when you put all that mulch up against there, it's like drowning the tree. It's like wearing the mask. You're basically suffocating that tree. So the trunk or the bark tissue has lenticels, and that's how oxygen exchange happens. So when you put all that mulch around there, you're smothering the tree. You know, looking at this little diagram here, you see the heartwood and the sapwood. That's the old tissue from when the tree was smaller. It lays down those rings. You have that cambium cell layer and the phloem, and then you have the outer bark, and the lenticels allow the oxygen exchange. But if you've smothered it, it can't do that. And so that, of course, is very unhealthy for the tree. And you can actually get rot and decay that happens. You might have some fungi or some bacteria, and it gets in there. That tissue starts to break down because it's rotting. And then that tree's nutrients are cut off in that area. And if that happens at over 50% of that trunk, what's going to happen? That tree's going to die because it can't get the nutrients that it needs up to the crown of the tree. So you may have this gorgeous, beautiful, you know, maple tree or oak tree or whatever it is, and you think you're helping it, but you're really killing it. So just be very aware of that when you think mulch is a good thing. We really don't recommend that you put any more than a couple inches worth. Just make sure you renew it. You know, you're not saving yourself any time if you have to spend a couple grand trying to remove this tree and clearing it out and all of that, and then figure out what to plant there. You're not saving yourself time or money doing that. All right. Again, more problems. So you can probably guess, some of you might be able to guess what we have here. Does anybody want to try and guess what kind of damage we're looking at here? Nobody? Okay. These little guys, metavoles. So you can see here they have pushed back the pine straw from around the base of the tree. So metavole damage. Voles are vegetarians. Some of you who have hostas might notice occasionally you'll have a hosta and it's beautiful and gorgeous, and then all of a sudden it starts to wilt. And you walk over there and you're like, I just watered this, what's wrong? And for whatever reason, you decide to tug on the plant and you're able to bring up the whole plant and there's no root system. That's a vole for you. So the reason they're able to do that is they use the mulch, pine straw or wood mulch, whatever it is. They use that as a way that they can tunnel in to get to the base of that tree and nibble on the bark. So in this case, they've gone through and moved that pine straw away from the base of the tree so that those little varmints aren't able to get up there. They actually have to be exposed so that hawks or owls or whatever is able to see them. So really, when you're putting mulch down, again, we say don't put more than, you know, a couple inches of mulch down there, but make sure that it's kind of pulled away from the base of the tree or the shrub. That's going to be the best course of action so that you don't end up with a girdled tree because it came through and nibbled it all or took off the root system. All right. Does anybody want to take a stab at what this picture is trying to tell you? Anybody? Bueller? Heat. So heat is the reason here. So this picture is actually from up north. I don't know, somewhere in Wisconsin or Minnesota or something like that. You can find all sorts of, blogs and articles online talking about how rocks are awesome to use in your landscape. Not really, not down here in the South. In fact, I don't recommend it at all. The sun intensity here is just too hot. It's too hot. Anything you put in white rock like this, be it lava rock or dark rock, actually, for that matter, marble or river stone or pebbles, whichever, it's going to be a heat sink. And so, yes, you're going to get a good bit of reflection here, but you're going to cook whatever is in there. So in the South, we just don't recommend that you use any type of stone like this in your landscape. It's fine if you want to have, a specimen type stone, like you see that one over to the right. We got a lot of big granite outcroppings around here, and that's absolutely fine if you want to have something like that in there. Just don't put down large amounts of river stone. You can put it in your hardscape, just don't put any plants in it. Just be mindful of that because it just has too much heat. All right. The good, the bad, and the ugly of staking trees. So we talked about the mulch and why you don't want to over mulch because of animals and root rot and adventitious roots. And so now we're going to talk about above ground with staking trees. So a lot of us, if you're getting a bigger tree and you're planting that, so something that's balled and burlapped, you're probably going to want to make sure that tree doesn't get blown over. We get a lot of bad weather here. So between the tropical systems that come through, between the thunderstorms that come through, we get some straight line winds that could knock over a lot of the trees that we just spent a lot of money planting. And then that's a major pain to try to get that thing uprighted and fixed. So a lot of times we'll put guy wires and on them, but that's a good thing for the first year or so. Once you start going past that first year, that's a bad thing because then you start with the girdling. So as I mentioned before, with the nylon cord that some people leave on, or some landscape crews leave on the balled and burlapped portion of the tree, so too is this a problem. So it doesn't really matter if it's, here they've got cut pieces of hose and some wire, and, most people, like you saw in the picture with the good and bad, the ugly, they're going to stake it in 3 different directions to try to prevent the wind from knocking it any one way. But if you don't remove that after about the first year or so, after that tree has started to establish, and you just kind of forget about it, because maybe the leaves are covering it, it's just not as noticeable, stuff like this starts to happen. So if you leave the wires in there, those are going to start girdling the tree. And as I've mentioned before, when you get a girdled tree, what happens? Cuts off the flow of nutrients. That tree eventually dies. So you've lost your investment. And here's a few additional examples of what happens. So you can see the trunk in the lower left. That one, they had supports down at the base, and that eventually did end up killing that Leland cypress, which you can see in the top left. That section of the tree was completely dead and had to be removed. And then you've got the cedar and then an oak, and the cedar's probably salvageable, but the oak may not be, which is a shame because, you've put a lot of time and effort allowing it to grow in your landscape, and, that's what happens. All right, the good and the bad. So when you're thinking about landscaping plants, and for those in the Master Gardener course, we're going to be having choosing ornamental plants, woody plants. We'll talk about this, landscape plantings. So when you're looking at which plants to put in front of your house, there's a lot of different things that you have to think about. But mainly the biggest that you do have to think about is, what are those plants going to look like 10 years from now when they're mature? So what they used to do 20 years ago, 30 years ago, boxwoods were really popular. Some of them can get quite large. And so landscapers a lot of times wouldn't put much thought into what the final size of these plants were. They were just, concerned about getting something in the ground so that the house looked decent. And so here you can see on the bad, you've got a really overgrown landscape, and you've got a lot of safety concerns with that. I mean, you could have somebody that's trying to break into your house. They've got cover. I mean, they can go crawl in those bushes and then go break into one of your windows. Nobody'd ever be able to see it from the street. So you've got, reasons, plus the whole house is covered up, the aesthetic's gone, there's no curb appeal. There's a lot of reasons why that looks bad. So you don't want to do that. On the good side, you've got some liriope, you've got some hydrangeas, you've got some Korean boxwoods. Those are small, dwarf. They fit the landscape, they fit the profile of the house. They're not going to grow out of size. You don't have something in front that's going to get huge as compared to the plants that are behind. It looks nice and it's going to stay nice. It's not going to get outsized. You don't have to put a lot of maintenance into it. So, don't compete with what you want the landscape to look like. Choose wisely on the front end so that on the back end, you can just enjoy it. You don't have to put a lot of effort into that. So does anybody want to take a stab at what's wrong here?
That tree is too close to that house.
True. Can you tell me why it's a bad idea, other than it's just too close to the house?
Because once the roots eventually grow up, like, they can mess up the foundation of the house.
That's right. So here you have some Leland cypresses, and those can get 30 to 40 feet tall. They also can be, 15 feet wide, like a 15-foot diameter. So yeah, I'm looking at the size between that sidewalk and that house, and it only looks like it might be 2.5 feet. So those trees, first of all, that root system is going to tear that house up if they ever were to get that size, but they're probably not. They're probably going to die long before that. First of all, Lelands kind of are bad choices anyway. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit in the future, but you don't want to put anything this big that will get to be a final, size of about 30 or 40 feet next to a house like this, next to a foundation. There really isn't a whole lot of room there anyway. If I was going to put something in that spot, it definitely wouldn't be a tree. It may not even be a shrub. I'd probably go for something like a perennial. Put some iris in or something else that's not going to have a crazy root system that you have to worry about getting into your foundation or, growing up through your siding or anything like that. This is just a bad choice. So don't do this. Don't plant too close together. So I know it's tempting when they're in, 1-gallon containers or 3-gallon containers to plant them really close together because you want that finished product to look great now, but just don't do it. Those crepe myrtles on the right, you probably could take one of them out in the middle and they would be about the distance apart that they would need to be, but those are just too close right there. And then on the left, you can't even tell what the foundation plantings are because they've just grown together in this jumbled mess, and it just looks messy and bad. And so you almost would have to go in and just rip all of that out, start over from scratch, which of course is a lot of money. And it's just, there's some stuff in there that just doesn't belong anyway, that is next to a foundation. Some of the trees shouldn't be there. Another thing, don't plant where there isn't enough space. So in this case, there's just not enough space. This is a blue Atlas cedar. They get really big, and this looks like it's next to an electrical box in the middle of an island in a restaurant parking lot. So not the right place. Here I know they probably tried to want to hide it. It's just not the right place for it. So that one is going to be a problem later on. Okay, bad landscape decisions. First and foremost, avoid planting troublesome plants. Troublesome can mean invasive. Troublesome can mean it's just a bad decision all around. You know, it's not a good choice. You know, it's got pest problems. It's got messy fruits, ginkgos. Don't plant a female ginkgo. It's got a lot of seed pods or shedding branches, that kind of stuff. So probably at the top of the list is the Bradford pear. These things were really popular with landscapers in some of the older subdivisions. We have them all over mine. They are cruddy trees. So after about 20 to 30 years, they start to break, and they are just horrible trees. You can see here's a broken one. And some of you might know why. You know, we talk about how we hate them so much. And that's because they have codominant stems. So when you have a tree, the strength in that tree, the strength or the ability for that tree to not break comes from the structure of that tree. So in, say, like maybe an oak or something else, you'll have one stem and then it'll usually branch, and you'll have kind of laterally moving stems, and that actually makes a tree strong. So the only time that's not necessarily the case might be in the situation of like a hurricane, where you have winds that are coming from one direction, and then all of a sudden you hit the eye and they flip the other way, or you've got back and forth and back and forth. So that will snap a tree. But typically when you get, you know, winds from the west and storms, that kind of thing, trees are actually pretty resilient. And so they can wave around an awful lot and they don't break. But when you have a Bradford pear, which has the codominant stems, so it might have like 5 stems that kind of go straight up, there's nothing there. So you have these, you know, the crotches, you might have some crotch rot in there. You can see in that picture, there's some rot going on. Those are just not very strong. And so when you get a storm that moves through, you know, those stems will chew this and then split, and it's a goner. And then you have to get the tree company out there to trim it up and move it out. So not only that, they're also really invasive, meaning, you know, they're part of the pear family, ornamental, but they make a little fruit. Birds will eat that, and then they disperse the seeds. So if you see, and I didn't put a picture up here, but I'm sure you all have seen it. So if you see a vacant pasture and in the spring, you'll get all those white flowers. That's the calorie pear, and that's the back crossing. So they're just a really bad idea, but you can still buy them. Unfortunately, South Carolina's outlawed them, but you can still buy them here. They still make the nursery industry a lot of money. All right. Red tip photinias, if you have been around the metro area for the last 25 years, these were really popular back then. The only problem is they've all died. Entomosphorum leaf spot is a fungal leaf spot, and typically with fungal leaf spots, it's not going to kill the plant. There are a few that's the exception. In this case, with the photinias, they do kill the photinias. So you can see here, this one is half dead. Most of the ones that I had in my neighborhood, I had one holdout down the street and it finally killed it or died. I don't know, it's probably, gosh, 25 years old. And the last couple branches of it died this spring. So just, you don't see them around here anymore. They are still in certain parts of the country, but the Atlanta, Georgia area, there's just too much heat, humidity, disease for these things. Spider mites on the cotoneasters. These plants are decent for really sunny locations, but unfortunately they get infested really easy with these little spider mites, and they're attracted to these plants for whatever reason, and they've got the piercing, sucking mouth parts, sucking out the plant juices, and they start looking really bad. They'll lose their leaves, they turn brown, they just look really bad. So don't plant these, bad choice. Cherry trees. Everybody loves a good ornamental cherry, don't you? I have them. I've got a Kwanzaa flowering cherry. They're beautiful. You have the Yoshinos, Okamis, the Kwanzans, even have wild cherries here, but none of them do good in this area. Typically their lifespans should be about 40 years, maybe longer. But here you're looking at maybe 15 or 20 years. If you can get it past that, it's probably on its last legs and you're going to have a lot of dead branches. That's what's called cherry tree decline. We don't get edible cherries at all. So I occasionally will get new folks to the area that'll call me up and they'll say, I want to be able to go pick some cherries and eat them. And we just can't do that here. There are no varieties that will survive in the heat humidity here. But cherries typically prefer a more alkaline soil, so somewhere in the like 8 range on a pH scale. And the soil here is typically somewhere like 5.5 to 6.5. So usually we'll tell you if you have a cherry tree and it's looking a little sad, do a soil test on it, confirm what the pH is. And if it's too low, you can usually lime it and that might buy you some time. But just know that they are not the best choice for this particular area. They just don't, even the native ones, a lot of times they'll just drop their leaves really early. They're just not a good choice. Not a good choice at all. And as we like to point out, right plant, right place, 80% of plant problems result from the inability of the plant to tolerate or adapt to the environment. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Let me check my time here. I like to talk sometimes. Okay, let me look at my phone. Okay, yeah, we're running a little late on time. So I'm gonna talk fast. We'll try to speed it up. So hardiness zones, we're in a 7B. You can kind of see there. Macon would be like an 8, and then up in the mountains, we've got 6B up into Rabun County and up along the northern tier. And that's going to help depend on, so the types of plants that you're going to choose are going to be what's works best, or usually is what's kind of in that middle zone, which would be 7B. So you're not going to be able to pick something that's semi-tropical, which would do well down in 8 or into Florida. And you're not going to want to pick something that is from the Midwest and try to bring it down here because it's going to be too hot for it. So you want to select plants that are adapted to the site and the local environmental conditions, just like I said. So make sure if it's a sun plant in the Midwest or maybe Kentucky, and let's just say it does well all the way down to 8. Here, it's probably going to be part sun. So that's mostly if you're from out of town and you're new, then sun intensity here is just way too hot. So we don't recommend putting, let's say a coneflower. You're probably better off if it's only part sun, maybe 6 hours versus 10 hours of sun per day. Intensity is just, your water needs are higher. The soil is going to dry out. You probably just want something that you're going to put it in part sun. Dwarf Alberta spruce. This is just a selection of things you shouldn't plant. We still get people that call up. Sometimes we'll get pictures and they sell them at the local nurseries. And we usually just, we don't want to say, hey, folks, it's got the word Alberta in it. Just don't plant it if it says that. And that's the reason why. So, they sell them because they don't get very big, only 10 or 12 feet, and they can take up to 30 years to reach maturity. But really, they only grow in zones 2 through 6, and we're 7B. So it's just too hot down here. Just don't plant them. No. Flowering dogwood. So this is a native, and in the right spot, it does wonderfully. It's very pretty. It's an understory plant, so you don't want to put it out in the middle of your sunny front yard. Okay, this is something that grows under the oak tree in the back or along the edge of the woods in the back. It doesn't want to go out to the full sun and it will be stressed. So it's more when they're stressed like that, they are more likely to get anthracnose. That's something that can kill a dogwood. So just like you or I, if you're sick all the time and you're constantly under stress from work or school or whatever, and you get sick a lot, same thing goes for trees. Is if they're stressed out because they're in the wrong growing conditions, they're going to die. Branch is going to die here. The whole tree is going to die. You know, usually we can tell they're not in the right spot. So that's why they look so bad. A good alternative is the Kusa dogwood or the Cornus Kusa. It is an Asian species and it can actually tolerate more dry conditions, and it actually will do pretty good in full sun. So it's an option. If you really want a dogwood, then consider putting that in instead of the flowering dogwood. If you're going to use the flowering dogwood, make sure it's in the right spot in your yard. It's in an understory. No. Hydrangeas. So here you can see they're in the middle of a parking lot. Most hydrangeas do well in moist shade, which is definitely not what this is. This is not moist shade. This is hot and dry. So these were long for this world and they did not survive very long, unfortunately. You know, there are some hydrangeas, you can get oak leaves, which are natives. Those will do okay in a sunny situation. So lots of morning sun or afternoon, preferably not full sun. Some of the panicle hydrangeas are tolerant of some sun, but really prefer afternoon shade. So just kind of, you know, read the description of what they like before you put them in there, but just know most hydrangeas are going to prefer more water and more shade. No. And here is where they love it most. So big leaf, panicle smooth, and climbing hydrangeas prefer moist shade. So yes. Native azaleas. I love native azaleas. Love, love, love them. There are all sorts of different kinds. There's the Piedmont, Florida, Oconee, Alabama, coastal, Red Hills, Cumberland, swamp. People don't realize how many different types there are. Those are all native. They're all throughout the Southeast. They come in different colors of yellows and oranges and almost pinks and whites and maybe almost to red. And then, of course, there's the hybrid varieties that are crosses. And I mean, you can get pretty much any color you want there. There's also Asian azaleas. I don't have those on here. Just know that those are evergreen, whereas the natives tend to be deciduous. They lose their leaves, most of their leaves, in the fall. And I will put, I have a, well, I'll have to share that after I stop screen sharing, but I've got a neat publication that lists out all the different types of native azaleas from Alabama. So it's definitely worth a read. Yes. And low maintenance plants, they don't require a lot of care. They don't shed. They don't have messy fruits. Choose those plants wisely, folks. Don't put in junky plants that have all sorts of problems. You'll regret it. Crepe myrtles, got to mention crepe myrtle. We don't like that. We tell people not to do it. Stresses the tree out. Shrubs only have a certain amount of energy and nutrients in the root system. And when you're constantly cutting them off and doing a really horrible prune like that, and they're constantly having to try to grow to overcome that, they will eventually use up their nutrients. They start getting problems. You get ambrosia beetles that are in there and they will die. If you haven't made it up to Helen, Georgia, their little mini golf area up there is almost all of the crepe myrtles up there, exact reason why they do crepe myrtle, and half of them are dead now because they have ambrosia beetles. It's just sad. So I mean, it can be such a really pretty small tree if allowed to just grow like it should. Japanese cryptomeria. So we have a Leland and we have a cryptomeria, and don't go with the Leland. Lelands have a lot of problems, and the cryptomeria is a good, I guess, solution to that. They look very similar. It's just that the cryptomeria is a lot slower growing. It doesn't have the disease issues Lelands have, which are shallow rooted, short-lived, and disease-filled lifespans. So I have some, but they're probably not going to be around for much longer because all the branches start dying underneath. They're just not good trees. So if you have an opportunity, don't plant the Lelands, pick the Japanese cryptomeria instead. Chase tree, Vitex. This is a good tree to have. You can train it either into a tree or to a shrub. It's a good pollinator tree. So these are yeses. It can tolerate full sun, and it's pretty easy to grow and very forgiving, drought tolerant, and it will thrive in hot weather. So I know in the Master Gardener class today, we had Seth Hawkins, he was talking about pruning. They went outside and did some pruning on some of the Vitex next to the building there. These are really nice trees. I have them. I like them. It's a good selection. You can keep them small or allow them to grow big. Carolina jessamine. This is a nice kind of native vining perennial. It's a slow, moderate grower, kind of showy in the landscape. You don't have to do much to it. You can allow it to grow on a trellis or something like that. It tolerates full sun or part shade, and it's adaptable to all soil types. Plus, it's deer proof. The reason it's deer proof is because it is poisonous. So just be aware of that if you have kids. It's not typically something that they'll munch on, but I did want to note that here. Pampas grass. So I have some of this in my landscape, very low maintenance. This stuff comes in different shades. You can get pinks or whites. It'll do well in full sun. It's drought tolerant once established, deer tolerant, pest tolerant, and it's actually salt tolerant too. So it grows along coastal areas as well. Florida anise, not to be, or anise, not to be confused with the star anise. This is a toxic plant, so don't go chomping on it, but it is tolerant of wet conditions. It's an underutilized native. It's a good understory plant, evergreen. Does well in shade or morning sun. I actually have a couple of these growing in my landscape. It has these small, red or white flowers depending on the variety, and it's a good choice for an understory if you don't want to have an azalea there or something else like that. And liriope, some people call it liriope, but this is probably, the unsung hero of shade. We have a lot of folks that say, I have full shade in my yard. I cannot grow anything. I don't want to have to overseed a fescue lawn. Please give me something that I can plant that I don't have to do anything to. And this is a good solution. So there's two varieties that we kind of recommend if you're looking for a lawn type variety. You have liriope spicata or muscari. The muscari version has the purple flower. You see that on the right. That's a clumping variety. And then the spicata, it has a white flower. That actually will creep along via rhizomes, and you can see that on the left. So it actually will fill in an area kind of like a lawn. You can go in and cut it in the spring, cut it down. I wouldn't recommend doing that all the time, or you can just kind of let it go. I have it on a hillside in almost full shade as kind of a ground cover to prevent erosion, and it's doing a great job. But it tolerates poor soils, sands, clays, deals with high heat really well, drought and salt spray, and it's pretty disease resistant. So again, it's pretty good for an area under a tree or something that just can't get anything else to grow. And you can plant hostas and other things in the middle of it. It won't necessarily outcompete. So good choice there. Abelias, this is a really nice plant. It's a good pollinator plant. Once established, it's pretty drought hardy, and it will tolerate full sun or partial shade. So I love this plant. I've got several in my yard, and there are both rather large varieties that can get, you can see this one's probably, 12, 15 feet tall, but there are some smaller dwarf varieties now that have pretty variegated leaves out there. So lots of good choices. And the redbud, so you have your typical native eastern redbud that you can see there, but there's also a lot of new varieties. So if you're interested, they can grow in full sun or dense shade. They aren't very big unless you have them as an understory, and then they will grow a little tall to reach. They tolerate moderate drought, so once established, you don't have to do anything. But there are some drawbacks. They do produce a lot of seed if you have the native Eastern variety, but you can see I've got the flamethrower and the Carolina Sweetheart. So there are some really interesting varieties out there. I wish I had enough sun. I'd get that flamethrower and a heartbeat. It's a pretty tree. It holds its autumn colors all year round. So you get your purples and your oranges and your bright greens. It's very pretty, or the variegated like you see, but there's almost everything in between. The Chinese pistache has great autumn color, tolerates full sun, tolerates drought, tolerates heat, tolerates clay soils, and it grows about 30 to 45 feet tall. So if you need a specimen tree for your front yard, it's perfect for that, and it's very pretty. It's got a very brilliant fall color. Daylilies. So these guys are very rugged and naturalizing. They clump or spread pretty, I mean, you don't have to do a whole lot to them. You just kind of put them in a bed and forget about them. They come in all sorts of pretty colors. You can see here, different varieties, ruffled, different colors, that kind of stuff. They prefer full sun, but will tolerate part. And like I said, they spread quite readily. So you've got plenty to share with your neighbor. And here's some with above average tolerance to moist soils, like weeping willows. Those you have to put them near the water. They will not do well in an upland site. And, you know, they're a good tree for right around a pond. But again, you know, consider something that's going to be in a sheltered area because they are more of a temperate type of tree. Red maples, bald cypress, Yelpin holly, dwarf hollies, sweet bay magnolias, wax myrtles, not so much here with the wax myrtle, Virginia sweet spire, clethras, iris, and some ornamental grasses. So if you've got a wet area or a damp area that holds a lot of water, some of these might be options. And then some plants not tolerant of wet sites, or like a rain garden. I was going to say rock garden. Junipers, they don't like wet feet at all. They prefer sunny, drought. Azaleas, again, they like moist and shady, but they don't want wet sites. Camellias, no. Cryptomerias, no. Leland cypress, nope. Ornamental cherries, Helera hollies, nope. And winter daphne, just not good, not good. And I whizzed through all of that. So that is basically it. And let's see. I ran off some people because I talk too much sometimes. Got a lot to say, I guess. But if anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask if you would like.
I did wanted to ask about the rocks. I did text you. I thought maybe you would send me a text back, but I was wondering if you actually have rocks and it's in the shade, will it be as bad? Would it be as bad as you're saying? You know, will it bake it like it's bad?
Full shade?
Yes, ma'am.
You know, you can probably, if it's full shade and like Riverstone or something like that, that's probably okay. I mean, we do suggest putting in a rain garden, and when you do that, you can have rocks in there, because you'll also have the sand and the stones and everything for the filtration of it. But it's mostly just going to be an issue with full sun. So we just don't want to see it in full sun.
Okay.
Anybody else have any questions?
I have a question. It's simple. You actually answered a part of it. By the way, it was a great presentation.
Oh,
I learned more in this class, and you know, YouTube can be so overwhelming. so I did learn a lot. But I have a question. When it comes to hydrangea, right? Because I moved to a house and I have everything. I have, from the sunny side, I do have a lot of shade area. And I heard some people say that fall is the best time to plant. So when it comes to hydrangea, it's always been my dream to have some of them. Can I plant them around this time, or should I wait the spring?
No, you can definitely plant them now.
I
Um,
can, okay.
the only thing that the only issue right now is that it's really dry. You're going to have to water. I mean, there's just no way around that. That 1 inch of rain per week, we just are not getting that. I mean, we're getting a little bit right now. It's probably, I mean, I'll have to go look, but it's probably around a half an inch. So if you want to plant now, you can definitely plant now. The weather's perfect for it temperature wise. It's just really dry. So be aware that you'll have to get out there and make sure that you water.
And if I follow your guide, about 1 inch a week. So that's okay.
Yeah, and so like the
mhm.
best way to do that, I mean, you can trying to think of so I mean, if you have a decent, let's say you got a 5-gallon, pot of something that you want to put down. And, a lot of times, like what I'm doing now is I've got a bunch of established oak leaf hydrangeas. They're struggling. It's just, I mean, they are semi-drought tolerant, but when they're an understory and you've got tree roots and they're all competing for moisture, they're unhappy and they're going to show you. They're going to wilt. And so even though these plants have been in my landscape for 15 and 20 years, they're struggling. So I'm taking my garden hose and I'm just putting it a slow trickle. I had my poor son out there today helping me out. And I like just put the hose right there at the base of the root system and then tell Siri to set an alarm for 15 or 20 minutes. And then you just let it run at a trickle. You can buy the soaker hoses that go around the base of a tree, but I mean, I'm not going to waste money on that when you can basically do the same thing with a regular garden hose. Or if you have a hose and you can set it on mist and just it like that, and then just let it go for about 15 minutes. And then that will help allow it'll give it the time to sink down into the soils so that the root system around the base can get it. And then just move it after 15 minutes to, I mean, right now we're kind of in survival mode. We have to be real careful because we don't know when it's going to start raining again. And you don't want to get to the point where they start coming up with draconian measures for like every other house. You can only water every other day. And then I think it was back in 2016 that it was pretty bad. We had a multi-year drought, 2 or 3 years, maybe it was 2009. Anyway, it got pretty bad. I mean, they pretty much cut off the ability for us to water unless it was a newly installed lawn or something like that. And we just don't want to get to that point. So I try to be really judicious with what I do water. So you may want to wait and not plant anything this fall.
Okay.
Or if you do, you may want to only plant half of what you were planning to plant this fall and just be very careful with how you water it. I mean, it makes me a little angry when I drive by and I see a sprinkler system that's just, going when it's raining, or is going every day. You don't need to water your lawn every day. I mean, we're heading into the fall when it's going to go dormant anyway. So just kind of let it go and it'll go dormant if you got Bermuda or Zoysia.
Okay.
Just be smart about it.
So the best way, because you also taught me about, so pretty much it's important to look at your calendar and see when if it's going to rain the next 2 weeks, so you can manage how you're going to water your plant or not water them. Pretty much is
yeah.
What?
I mean, you can we call it the tuna can method. I mean, you can get a rain gauge. Ace has them. They're these little tiny ones. Just set it next to where your tree is. Look at it, and if it's not an inch, then you need to go ahead and water.
Got you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Couple of people asking for review. Yes, I record. So once I get into the office, I upload it to our Metro Master Gardener YouTube channel. So it'll be made public so you can watch it there. So just it's called Metro. I'll type it into the chat box. Oops. So just search for that on YouTube, and then you can can't talk. You can subscribe and then check it out. You know, we get a lot of, I mean, I think I had almost 32 people registered for this, and I had about 22 that showed up, which is actually pretty good. But we always get folks that get tied up at work and can't watch for whatever reason. So no notes or handouts. So, but you can watch it on the Metro Master Gardener channel if you really want to. I do provide notes for the Master Gardener class, but I typically don't for these presentations. And I was going to, give me a second and I'll see if I can find that azalea bulletin. It's really good. Native azalea. Where? There it is. Yeah, I'm a big fan of native azaleas. Once established, they're very hardy and really pretty blooms in the spring. There we go. So you can read all about the different varieties that I mentioned, and they've got pictures of them and descriptions and that kind of thing. So we have an extension plant sale every year that usually we do pre-sale from January through early March, and then you pick it up at the Gwinnett County Fairgrounds. We try to offer some ornamentals. We try to offer some edible plants, you know, like blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, that kind of thing. I try to have a good selection of both native and other types of ornamentals. Last year, we got some native azaleas in. I don't think too many people knew about it, but trying to get some more in this year. So kind of looking forward to being able to offer that, since those are usually a big seller. So encourage you to take a look at our website, UGA Extension Gwinnett, and usually we'll post that plant sale form on the first page. Pretty reasonable prices and good quality merchandise. But anyway, that's basically it. So if anybody has any other questions, if you don't, then, you know, we'll pretty much go ahead and end it. And thanks for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.